Hello everyone, welcome to part 2 of the anatomy of the heart. Today we'll learn more parts of the heart and the layers that make up the outsides of the heart. If you haven't watched part 1, I highly recommend that you watch it. I provided a link in the description below, so let's get started. The first thing we'll cover today is the interventricular septum, which is this thing over here. So let me just write that down for you. The interventricular septum. And we can tell a lot from its name. So in part 1, we learned about how these two chambers are called the ventricles. Okay, the ventricles. And the interventricular septum is a barrier really that divides these two ventricles. So I just want to point out that this interventricular septum has two parts to it. So the top bit is a membranous part, okay? And this is very thin compared to the muscular part. And a common defect that many babies have, which is called VSD. Okay? VSD. And it stands for Ventricular Septal Defect. And it basically means when babies have a hole in this membranous part of the interventricular septum. And this means that the blood from the right ventricle can get into the left ventricle and vice versa. So we're finished with the interventricular septum. Now I'd like to move on to the valves, and in particular the atrioventricular valves. The atrioventricular valves. And judging by the name, you can guess that these are the valves between the atriums and the ventricles. So, obviously, we talked briefly about these valves in part 1. And we know that this valve here is called the tricuspid valve, and this valve here is called the mitral valve. And you might be wondering, what's stopping them from flipping back and forth like this when the blood passes through it? Well, these valves have a very interesting strategy, and what they actually do is they tether themselves to the walls of the ventricles, like so. So these structures have two parts to them. So the rope-like structure is called the chordae tendineae. The chordae tendineae. And the muscle-like structure at the bottom, it's actually a muscle, is called the papillary muscle. Okay. The papillary muscle. And together, the chordae tendineae and the papillary muscles stop the valves from flipping back and forward and making the blood go in the wrong direction. So these are very, very important. We're finally finished with the parts of the heart. So now let's move on to the layers of the heart. And by this, I mean the outsides of this incredible organ. So I'm actually going to draw a box here. And we can then enlarge this, and we can get a better view of what the layers of the heart actually are. So I've drawn a blown up version of this little rectangle over here, but I've also drawn something inside it. Let me explain. So the heart has 3 layers to it. The first of which is the endocardium. Okay, let me just use a different colour. The endocardium. And this layer lines the inside of the heart. The inside of the heart. So that's all of this. So let me just label it. the endocardium. The endocardium. And what's also interesting about the endocardium is that it's what lines the inside of arteries and veins. So it's what red blood vessels bump into all the time. The second layer of our heart is known as the myocardium. Okay, the myocardium. And myo means muscle. So let me just draw it out. So this is the myocardium. The myocardium. And it's pretty obvious, but it's the most chunkiest layer of the heart. So it's where most of the energy is being used. And let me just point out that this is where all the contractile tissue is. So it's what's doing the pumping of the heart. So the third and most final layer of the heart is what's called a pericardium. Okay, pericardium. And what's interesting about the pericardium is that it has two layers, and in between those two layers there's a gap. Okay, so all of this is a gap. Well, there's a tiny little bit of fluid, but that's not the point. It doesn't have any living cells in it, okay? We'll go on to that later. So the inner layer is what's called a visceral pericardium, okay? So visceral pericardium. And the outer layer is called the parietal pericardium. The parietal pericardium. And let me just label this entire layer as the pericardium. The pericardium. So you still might be wondering, why is there a gap between the visceral pericardium and the parietal pericardium? Well, it all starts when you're a little fetus, okay? So let's say that this is a fetus heart, a little fetus heart. And when you're a fetus, you actually have a balloon underneath your heart. So when your heart is growing, the balloon actually starts to envelop the heart like this. So it folds back by itself. So by the time it's a fully grown heart, the balloon actually doesn't look like a balloon anymore. It's more like a kind of bottle that goes all around the heart. And that's what's known as the pericardium. So quick recap. So the interventricular septum is a wall that divides the right ventricle from the left ventricle. The chordae tendineae and the papillary muscles both work together to support the valves from flipping back and forth. The endocardium is the most inner layer of the heart. It's what the red blood cells bump into. The myocardium is the chunkiest layer of the heart. It's where all the work and all the pumping happens. The pericardium, as we just discussed, is like a balloon that envelops the entire heart. The innermost layer is called the visceral pericardium, and the outermost layer is called the parietal pericardium. That's all from me today, guys. Next time, we'll look at blood vessels and the movement of blood around the body. We'll look at capillary beds, we'll look at arterioles, and more. Don't forget to subscribe and hit that like button. Bye for now.